This is Brainy Podcasts with Soraya Shaw and Tracy Filler, inspiring creativity and innovation through evidenced neuroscience.
We're delighted to be joined in our first episode of Series 2 by David Wilkinson, where we are going to be utilising all of his skills, talents, experience and expertise in discussing the human advantage as we move into the fifth industrial revolution. David is a psychologist and educationalist and a leading expert on dealing with ambiguity, uncertainty and developing emotional regulation. Today, David is the founder and editor of the Oxford Review, and we formally welcome you. Thank you for joining us today, David. And so when we found out we could have you as our guest for this one, I was really excited because not only are you an expert around leadership and organisations, but you're also, from what I understand anyway, quite knowledgeable around the technological advancements as well. So we had an episode in last series where we had Ross Stevenson talking about AI and how that was going to be integrated and fairly standardized. And here we are less than 6 months on, and already that's yesterday's news. Yeah. So I think it's about sort of looking at, as Soraya said, it's about bringing all the brains in your organization and optimizing that. And, you know, he talked very much about repetitive tasks being moved to technology so that it's freeing up your workforce and optimizing their full capability and strengths and tapping into currently underutilized talent.
And so therefore it's sort of, we've got to look at our own humanity and our own creativity and our own innovation to keep that edge.
Yeah, and there's more. I'm doing a series of lectures and some research around this at the moment, and how we get sucked in by the language that's used around AI. So I'm a psychologist and I'm interested in the impact that AI is having on human beings, heuristics around, like ways of thinking around AI, where they're anthropomorphizing AI and giving it capabilities that it doesn't have. It doesn't see us.
Interesting.
It doesn't understand. It can't understand. So we use words like, which are human things. Knowledge is a human thing. Information is different stuff. Knowledge comes from human beings. We are presented with information and then we have to process it and turn it into knowledge. Then we start thinking about wisdom. Again, it's a human thing. AI can't be wise. It can generate an output, but that's all it's doing. And people seem to assume that what AI is doing, generative AI particularly, what it's doing is it's like this vast database of stuff and that it's going off and finding information. It's not even doing that. What it's doing is, and very cleverly, because it appears like it's going off like a big database, what it's actually doing is it's trained on data to look for language patterns with certain like triggers. Right. So if you ask it something, what it's not doing is it's not like a database going off and finding the information or retrieving it like a human being is. What it's doing is saying, right, okay, these are the chunks of information, the tokens, the bits of words that this person has used in your prompt, then generates a language pattern that cleverly mimics a database. But it's not a database. It's generating information. And that's why it hallucinates, because it's not actually drawing information up. It's drawing a language pattern up.
I think there's we're moving potentially to a tipping point around that. It's interesting you describe it as a language software, because I think if you're using it regularly, that you start to notice the patterns in that language. And I'm actually repelling from certain words because I recognize them as AI language. And I want to make sure that there is a distinct difference between what the human being, am saying and what support I might have reached out for through AI.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we turned off. You read it in other people's copy.
Definitely turn it off.
Switches you off because you recognize it straight away.
I've got Illuminate's one that comes up a lot. As soon as I see that, I think, get rid, don't want to read that. And what makes it worse is there's no wisdom, there's no additional input from, you see it on LinkedIn all the time, people putting these posts out there and they've just popped it into chat. There's not them in there. There's no human in there.
The trust index, you're listening to me now. You will be making a judgment about, without realizing it, you're evaluating everything I say, all the rest of it. But in amongst all of that, you will be working out whether I know what I'm talking about, whether I'm lying, whether I'm like, I don't know what I'm talking about and I'm just making it up. Right. And that's important. And we do that because we have all of these cues that we've learned about, you know, what's on people's faces, how they look, and, you know, whether they go red at this moment in time, all of those kinds of things. We make a judgment about, does this person actually know what they're talking about? And does it sound plausible, credible? Am I going to believe them? So this is called the trust index. Now, humans seem to be set. So the trust index works from 0 to 1, which is like a probability. When we're talking to a human being that we don't know and we've got no previous with, our trust index is usually set around about 0.65, which means that we're going to believe most of what they say unless we get some evidence to the contrary. So we have this trust index kind of built in. They then tested ChatGPT. ChatGPT's own trust index of the information that it appears to be generating, get this, is 0.99. It believes everything that it puts out. And what's worse is that when we interact with it, because of the rhetorical elements that it uses, when we interact with it, our trust index goes up to something like 0.9. We trust AI more than we trust humans.
But in a way, that when you say it logically like that, from a neuroscience point of view, from my point of view, it makes a huge amount of sense, because actually our brains are always making the connections because of their own experience, their own DNA, everything that we know about neuroplasticity and neurogenesis and everything else. Our brains are already kind of networked to believe AI because the PR is there to believe it. So that's what's quite interesting, and there's so much make believe in there and hype that's why, to your point, people trust AI over other human beings and over Google.
But we could have been faulty in our hypothesis, or we could have missed something, or there could be a variable in here that we don't know about. And this is what science is about. Science is about the things that we believed to be true 50 and 100 years ago. A lot of it we don't believe to be true anymore because we've got new methods, new ways of thinking, new evidence. Knowledge is dynamic. That's very different from data and information, but knowledge is dynamic. It's growing and developing our understanding of something, just like our understanding of our partners or anything. It's kind of developing. It's a dynamic process. So we have this kind of definition of critical thinking of firstly recognizing that knowledge isn't static. It's an argument, and it's an argument from a perspective with a set of values and things like that. That good knowledge or good argument is based on the best available data, the best available evidence right now. But we also know that evidence is both as valid and reliable as we can make it. But there's no such thing as 100% reliability and validity. It's a program.
How does this inform us then for creativity and innovation in organizations? So how do you, because what we're talking about is absolutely fascinating, and I know we could talk for hours on it. But how does that translate into real life for real organizations, for leaders, for people trying to do their jobs when, this is going on?
Right. I think there's a couple of things. One is there seems to be some evidence that AI is leading to this kind of more cognitively lazy ways of doing things, just kind of taking it off and using it as a blog post, that it's reducing critical thinking, it's reducing creativity, human creativity. Whereas we're starting to rely on something that's not reliable. And what we should be doing and what organizations need to be doing is starting to help humans think better and be more creative rather than starting to rely on the machines.
Yep.
Now, the machines are helpful. I'm not saying they're not helpful at all. And I use AI a lot, but I don't accept what it's saying. I use it for a whole series of things. I think organizations and institutions like universities and things have a responsibility to help people to work with things like AI. They're great tools. They're very useful. They can come up with some ideas. So what I tend to do if I need ideas for something, I'll say, give me 20 ideas around this. It'll come up with them. As I'm reading those ideas, I then start having other ideas. It's those other ideas now that are important, not
So you
the
can use it as a
AI's
prompt, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's prompting me.
Makes sense. So far you've said that our human advantage comes from our ability to understand and create meaning from information, the values systems that we as an individual, a leader, or an organization operate under, to create perspective and to think critically and assess and review. And also what comes from our knowledge is that expertise. So how are we going to use that? Where is that? It's fairly obvious what the strengths are of that, but how is that going to be manifested day to day? How are you going to show up for work as an individual and really let that operate and have a light on it? And as a leader, how are you going to optimize that in the individuals that you are responsible for?
As a human being, I'm part of a social structure. There's a whole load of values in there. I can take different perspectives. I can look at things from different ways. I can empathize, because all of these things as a human being, I can do.
I guess as a leader, what we need to encourage is that there's an element of filtering and checking on research and the depth of that research and the questioning that's gone into what's being put in front of them as the solution, as the next big thing for them, whatever it is that task is representing.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And the human in the system is really important here. It's an important part of it, because we have all of these other things like emotions, like values, empathy,
Connectivity in the brain.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the connectivity between three brains here, thinking about things. And going, oh, hang on a minute, I hadn't thought about that. Oh, yeah. And that leads to something else. So the social element becomes really important. And it's the same with learning. And it's organizations are kind of heading down a bit of a slippery slope if they don't really understand what this stuff is. It's really useful stuff, but it's really useful stuff if we help the humans to become better thinkers. We can do better things with AI and humans.
Yeah, so that outcome hasn't changed from when we spoke with Ross, actually, because I remember him ending with the future is most definitely human. And that's why we wanted this to really look at how do we live alongside this fifth industrial revolution and ensure that the humans there on top being spotlighted for all the uniqueness of what makes our brains so incredible.
Yeah. And then comes the question, so how do we develop the humans to operate in this new world?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, and there's a whole load of work being done around that at the moment, around learning and things like that. How do we learn in this new world where of instant connectivity, ability to be able to go off and get information instantly? We still need critical faculty. We still need creativity, wisdom, our ability to be able to generate knowledge, question it, talk to each other, all of those kinds of things.
I was just going to ask, what can we learn from previous industrial revolutions that might help?
Well, that's a really, really good question.
You know, most companies are working in a tumble dryer, as I call it. You know, everything's happening so fast and it's also confusing and people don't know what's happening. So, and leadership has got so much on its plate at the moment. You know, leaders being people being asked to do so much, which is why we've got burnout, mental health, everything else. So how can we guide people? Because they'd say, yeah, we really get that. But you know what? We haven't got the time to do that thinking. We've just got to keep, keeping competitive in our market, keeping our talent, keeping our people. And we need to get people being creative and innovative. So how can we support them to do that? What can we give them to do that? Because you, as a critical thinker, are hopefully the one who's sitting back there going, now, how do we want to work with this in the future?
Well, it's those provocations. So it's going to organizations and provoking thought. So when you think about like going back to medieval times, right? We had a king and a queen, and there'd be a court, and there'd be all these people in the court doing all these things, and and it's Game of Thrones actually posits it really well. What was interesting in those days, and the days of knights and dames and like kings and queens and all the rest of it, is that quite often they had a court jester. Now, the court jester wasn't just there for fun and to laugh at. The court jester was there to hold a mirror up and would show the absurdity of the systems and would create provocations, would take the mickey out of somebody who was doing something ridiculous. And the court jester, what was interesting was the court jester was protected. Now, organizations need a court jester. They need someone who isn't beholden to the management and isn't frightened for their job, who can hold a mirror up to it and say, this is stupid. This doesn't make any sense what we're doing. We're creating a problem here that if we don't do something with it, we're going to have a problem, but we can do it with humor. Organizations are all too flipping serious. They believe in themselves too much. They believe in what they're doing too much.
That holding the mirror up is quite interesting, because actually that's what we do as coaches. That's one of our roles as coaches in organizations, is it actually to hold that mirror up and go, hold on a sec, this is what I'm seeing. And because quite often people don't notice. They don't realize.
We're creating provocations, and organizations should be building this into the organization, that there's a jester in there. The jester was not a fool. The jester was usually a really clever person, because they were observing things and they were going, right, okay, I can see patterns here. I can see what's going on. I can see how this is functionally stupid, how this is dysfunctional. That's what I'm going to take the mickey out of.
Yeah. So I'm thinking that's potentially why non-exec directors are hired to be that court jester, but they just join the table.
Yeah, they do what they agree with everybody else because they're part of the culture. And we really need people who are good at observing, that don't make people defensive, so that they move into denial.
So this is where we come back to the social brain and the whole psychosocial safety and psychological safety, because it's all well employing the jester, but if the jester's about to have his head cut off because he's holding up a mirror and people don't like what's seen, you've got to create that culture, haven't you, where that trust and that stability and that respect exists, so everybody has the freedom to say, do you know what, I don't like what you're doing over there, or we could be doing this better, or whatever it might be. But it has to be that culture where people feel socially safe, where they feel secure to be able to do that and engaged and valued.
And it's about creating cultures where there's voice, where people are genuinely speaking up and they're being listened to. Human development part of this is about, how do we hear the feedback? How do we react to having the absurdities pointed out to us? Because it can be painful, particularly if I've worked for something for years and someone shows me that actually a whole lot of it's been ridiculous.
Can you think of an organization that is doing that well, that is having the mirror held up and fed back and utilizing all the brains in their business?
No.
Oh God, David, that's awful.
Depressing.
There are systems. So you asked me about organizations, but I do see systems where this happens. So I'll give you a couple of examples from those. If you go to the special forces, for example, they have a really robust kind of feedback system. So they'll do briefings, they'll carry out an operation, do debriefings, and the debriefings from the outside look brutal because they matter. An inch this way and an inch that way when you're in a firefight can mean the difference between life and death, not just for the enemy, but for you too. And, if you're in the wrong place, doing the wrong things, you really need to know. And the whole idea of high-performing teams, good sports teams are like this. If you watch some really good teams, is this constant chatter. It's all chatter all the time. And it's not just chatter as in like nice water cooler chatter, it's feedback. And it's honest feedback. And it's going, hang on a minute, I don't agree with that. Or, whoa, there's a gap over there. People are recognizing things and seeing things so that there's this chatter going on, this honest feedback, this honest appraisal. People are thinking about things, giving each other feedback without taking offense on a constant basis. What we do is we operate these kinds of weird kinds of systems, and then we stop talking and people go quiet.
That's that fear culture, isn't it, that's created. And what happens is, as we all know, you've shut everybody's brains down because they've gone into security mode, because I need to survive. And so again, part of that whole, I think the system is how you build a resilient system within that, which I think...
So there's another problem, though, that organizations are facing, and it's the fact that they're organizations. You think about the term organized, being organized, organization, therefore organized. So largely what they've got is they've got systems, they've got structures, policies, procedures, processes. And when you think about all of that, what are those things? What are they? Well, actually, what they are is a way of telling people what they can and can't do, what decisions they're going to make, what decisions they're not going to make, and this is important, what they're going to be involved in and not involved in. If you're in the finance department and you think the advertising department's doing something wrong or making a cock up of things or whatever it happens to be, right, and you wander into the marketing department and say, I've got some feedback for you, who's going to listen? Well, get out of here, you don't know our job. So we have all of these processes, and what they actually are, the systems, the structures, the policies, procedures, and processes, they're heuristics for decision making, and they're taking decisions away. And if you see a mistake made in an organization, there's a new policy so nobody ever makes that mistake again. Why? We want the mistakes. We want people to learn to be resilient, to learn to have failures. But we have this kind of idea of a failure-free organization. And, you look at good entrepreneurs and small businesses, they're all about failures. And we go back to this whole thing about hypothesis testing. We learn more from the failures than we do the successes.
Yeah.
And organizations should be setting up a system where failure's heralded because you've tried something. What happens is, if we don't like failure, people don't try stuff.
There was a comment from Elon Musk that came out, was what would happen if we had no organizations? Which we both thought about, didn't we? Yeah, made us stop and think. It was like, oh.
Yeah, so what I'm not arguing for is no organizations. What I am arguing for, though, is that the organizations recognize the weaknesses of being an organization, and they try to do things to mitigate that, to ameliorate the situation. So treating all decisions as the same kind of decision is not good for developing resilience, for example. If organizations now start to think about the kinds of decisions they're making, they can categorize them of critical decisions. So these are the decisions that if you get them wrong, you're going to lose the business. Expensive decisions, if you get those wrong, you're not going to lose the business, but it's going to cost a lot. It could cost a lot in reputation. It could cost a lot in finance. And there's a golden rule for those two. If we have critical and expensive decisions, those kinds of things that are going to cause the organization real stress, then the golden rule is no one person should be making that decision. As I say, there are people, seriously, that have 100 ideas before they've got out in the shower in the morning. And they don't care whether 99 of them fail, because there's always another one. They'll just try that. They're happy. They'll just play. Let them play.
Puts me in mind, Soraya, of you describing our brains as a black box. And what we feed into it is what we get back. And it's just sort of dancing with that critical thinking element that you were talking about earlier, David, and that you said you just need to sort the right questions out. And there's been a lot of discussion here about asking the right questions. And so ideas people are happy to ask their brain all sorts of questions, unfiltered. And one of them is going to be the right question.
Yeah, and very rarely do you hit on the right question straight away. But it's the questions that get people thinking that they suddenly go, oh, hang on a minute. What? Oh, hang on. And they haven't actually said anything. And you can suddenly see these things tripping in their heads.
Yeah.
Now, that's slightly different, but that's...
Well, it's the light bulb moment. It's the insight moment, isn't it? They're the ones that will actually benefit from working with AI, perhaps, because it can be task focused and help them do things more effectively or more efficiently, whereas the people who love uncertainty, actually, they want to have that freedom to play and to think and to be curious and to take lots of showers.
Rely on it. So the other thing that seems to be a thread, Soraya, when we're talking, we're always talking about how the brain's constantly talking with itself and connecting and those connections, but how important connectivity is for humans in order to ideate, to develop critical thinking, and to stop living with status quo.
We are social animals, and creativity comes. Learning is a socially mediated process. And what that means is we learn best with other people. There's a whole load of experiments around. If you go off and learn something on your own, you're quite likely to go down a lot of blind alleys that you don't know you're going down. And it's only when you start talking to somebody else, you go, oh, that's not what I thought it meant. And you've probably had that experience lots. So, learning groups, like online learning's fine, but there needs to be a social element. And it's those kinds of things that we really need to be thinking about in organizations. It's great having like online learning, but what is it that's going to help us think about these things? And it's usually other people.
And good questions.
Very important point. Yeah. Now we get to kind of the end of our wonderful time together. What salient thing do you want to say to us? What salient thing should we be thinking about, or has come to mind to you having this conversation with us?
I think one of the big things is around developing a kind of a personal evidence-based practice. And it's this, not got a bad name, but it sounds kind of staid, is that we're thinking of this idea of metacognition, that we're thinking about our thinking, that we engage in things in the world, including AI and everything else, in a way where we're aware of our, like, oh, hang on a minute, moments. And that we don't just accept everything, that we're proactive in the world, that we're curious and questioning, and that we go off and follow those questions.
Creativity is not on the children's agenda anymore.
Oh, PISA 22.
Yeah. And what's actually going on there? We've been talking about the importance of it, especially being human. And yet, it's being taken off the curriculum. So children aren't being taught.
Well, the UK haven't signed up for it basically yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that's not on the curriculum is they don't teach critical thinking. And creativity and critical thinking are the two. If there's two things that should be on the curriculum, both of those, helping to develop creativity and helping to develop critical thinking. And there was a really interesting set of studies done going back, looking at critical thinking in students just going into universities, and which students tended to be kind of critical thinkers as they walk in, and which students tended not to be. They tended to just accept things and wanted to learn things by rote. And one of the studies was really interesting, because what we know is, like, somewhere around about, very rough figures, somewhere around about 70 to kind of 90 something % of students, when they walk into universities, tend to prefer to learn by rote, but tend not to enjoy it. They don't like learning like that, but that's their preferred style. Like it, but they prefer it. And you've got to go, well, what's going on here? That doesn't make any sense. So there was a really interesting study looking at where this small percentage of students who were critical thinkers, who were using evidence, thinking about the validity and reliability of things, checking things behind, really getting into things, of kind of between kind of 5 and 25% of the students that walk into universities. And this study went to try to find out where they'd come from. Why were they like this? Why were they critical thinkers? And largely, it's not, there's a lot more diversity in this, but largely the two biggest places that they came from. One was they'd done the International Baccalaureate that specifically teaches critical thinking skills. And there's a whole load of studies about learning critical thinking that you need instruction in it. You need to understand what it is and the structure of it. And then the second one was they hadn't gone to school.
They had been indoctrinated.
Says something about our educational system.
Brainy Podcasts. Last thoughts.
Okay, so what were your thoughts on that?
It was fascinating. Particularly for me, the court jester
No, definitely.
story and understanding. I never knew that about the court jester's role.
I always knew that they were always protected. They were seen as quite precious. And I think what's interesting, if you take that into today's terms, is actually how you need people who are brave enough to be able to say, hey, that's not working, or this is wrong, to actually be able to create that environment where people can be creative and innovative. If they're working in fear, then you're never going to get the best out of people at all.
And I thought about it when obviously our context is creativity, innovation, ideation. There's an element of improv, because there's a lot that the court jester used to do that, if you came up in alternative comedy when it first came back in the 90s, that observational comedy, which is creating something to make us smile out of reality, out of what's noted and what's seen around you. And so it's another way of being creative, to spot these patterns, trends, what they're noticing, and shining a light, and, as we use that phrase a lot, holding a mirror up.
Yep. I think that's right. And seeing those and then, as you say, seeing the patterns, and then what are the insights that you actually get from that? Yeah. And also, I suppose the other bit with the jester, which we both like so much, was, it's about small steps. It's not about huge leaps. It's about the incremental small changes that you make, turning the dial, that actually make the difference.
Yeah, you're right. There was a huge amount there. And I guess we're still, whilst a lot has moved on technologically wise, because we did a little bit of talking around the fifth industrial revolution that we're entering into, and not sure we're all fully equipped for it, that even though things have moved on from when we were interviewing with Ross, the future's still definitely human. That's good to know. And I think that leans us really nicely into our next episode, where we're being joined by Leanne, where we start to look at the environmental impact on creativity and innovation, and a bit of a deeper dive than we've perhaps tackled in earlier episodes.
And also, I think with Leanne's, the whole social brain, and how important the social brain is for people, which is just part of who we are, and going for that deeper dive into neuroscience, and why it's so important for us as human beings.
Yeah, well, that should be enough to get people to tune in and stay with us and listen to the next episode. Leanne Drew McCain is another neuroscientist. She lives in Australia, and she's the chief executive of the National Psychological Safety Network in Australia. So she knows her stuff.
Enjoyed this episode? Listen to more at brainycasts.com.